My name is John Mayo. I am a professor of economics, business, and public policy in the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown. I am also the executive director of our host for today, which is the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy. Today, I am just really tickled to be able to host an event that we have titled Title II Net Neutrality and the Struggle for Balance in Broadband Regulation, and this is the important part, how did we get here? How did we get here? This is, I think, a very important discussion to have at this particular junction. Many of you know today has been called a day of action. And I think that's wonderful that we have a day of action. Again, you might have thought to have that indoors at 10:30 in the morning in the air conditioning instead of at noon outside of the Capitol, but I'll let that be. What I do think is important is that we celebrate this day in part with a day of reflection, or an hour and a half. We won't take a whole day, an hour and a half of reflection. Because if we're going to be smart about moving forward, we have to understand fully how we got here. What are the predicates? What put us in the position that we're in today? For moving forward smartly, we need to understand this on a regulatory front and on a legislative front. So in that regard, I am just really, really pleased that we're going to be able to have this discussion. The way the day is going to unfold, or this event is going to unfold, is in two parts. The first part, I'm delighted to say that we have Commissioner Michael O'Rielly from the Federal Communications Commission. As all of you know, the FCC is the nation's leading independent regulatory agency governing telecommunications and internet policy, subject to the laws of the land. It is in that context that Commissioner O'Rielly has been nominated twice and confirmed twice by the United States Senate to serve as one of the nation's leading policymakers in telecommunications. So it's a treat to have him here today to offer his perspective on how did we get here. The second part, and he's graciously said that he will allow some Q&As. I'll offer tee it up with some discussion, then we'll have some Q&As. And there are a number of, I saw the list of people that signed up for this event. Many of you are experts in your own right. We'd love to hear from you. So Commissioner O'Rielly is going to graciously take some questions. Be thinking of your questions that you might want to ask as he is speaking, or as we are speaking. The second part of the morning is going to be a panel that will be moderated by Georgetown's own Larry Downs. Larry is the director of the project director for the Evolution of Regulation and Innovation Project at the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy. He and Carolyn Brandon were instrumental in organizing today, and for that I'm very, very grateful. Thank you very much. Larry, aside from his duties at Georgetown, is a best-selling author, a frequent commentator in the public press and the academic press, and an attorney, a lawyer by training. And Larry is going to introduce his panel. I won't steal his thunder. I'll simply say that there is an absolutely blue ribbon group of people that will speak that have, I think, a lot to say about how did we get here? How did we get here? So with that, let me ask Commissioner O'Rielly to join me. I guess if you're a commissioner, they offer you water. If you're just a Georgetown professor, you go without. That's okay. Commissioner O'Rielly, there are certain days that are indelibly etched in all of our minds, I think, as adults. September 11th, 2001, the day the Challenger disaster happened. For those of us old enough, I don't think that's you, but it is me that I certainly remember the day that John Kennedy was shot. Most people don't remember the day the Telecommunications Act was passed. Maybe some people in this room do, but we don't think about that in any sort of elevated tones normally, and to think about that with the importance and the deference that perhaps it deserves. It was a critical piece of legislation in reshaping our nation's telecommunications policy. So with that tee up, let me ask you if you could just take us back down memory lane a little bit and reflect on, first I'm just sort of curious what in the world you were doing in 1996, but then also what were the precipitating events? How did we get this Telecommunications Act? What were the key drivers of it? How in the world did we forge something resembling a bipartisan consensus, which is almost an oxymoron in today's parlance? But if you could sort of set the tone there in thinking about how we got started with this.
Absolutely. Well, first, my thanks to Georgetown, to John, to Larry, to Carolyn, to FCC Commissioner Roth, some very good friends. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. You ask an interesting question, and the panels, the whole presentation actually caught my interest a couple months ago when we talked about participating. It's just a really interesting topic. How did we get here? I commonly like to say that I was there for every meeting, almost every meeting, every conversation on the 96 Act, but I'd like to be clear that I didn't write the 96 Act. I was a little younger. I didn't have gray hair. I didn't have a 2-year-old toddler running around causing craziness in my household or a wife. So it was a much different day in my life. But substantively, how did we get there? And you have to think back that 1996 really wasn't 1996, it was really 1995. It passed in February 8th, if I remember. It was really the work of 1995, and 1995 came after the election in 1994. So November 1994 totally changes the dynamic of Capitol Hill and of Washington. Republicans take over the House first time in 40 years. It completely changes the dynamics of how legislation is going to happen. My old boss at the time was elevated to the chairman of the Commerce Committee, renamed then the Commerce Committee, and we went about, the policy leaders on the committee, my former bosses, went about figuring out how do we approach telecommunications policy. Now, in fairness, the previous couple Congresses had contemplated different things on communications policy. How do we update the Act based on, and one of the fundamental driving pieces of the 96 Act was the breakup of AT&T and the modified final judgment from Judge Harold Green from the DC Circuit, and what were the ramifications for that. And we find, multiple years of fighting through that process, and previous Congresses had their take on the issue. Certainly the previous Congress to ours, to the 104th, had a particular viewpoint. So we started with that vehicle, and the authors, I was a young kid at the time. I was helping along the process as best I could. But you started with that document, and we went through with the chairman what provisions stay and what go, and then figure out what else needs to be added to reflect his views, the new Congress's views, to be able to be enacted, what makes sense in the universe. So first and foremost, it was about addressing the modified final judgment and opening up the local competition, the local telephone market to competition. So long distance and local, things that people don't think about today. There actually was a long distance market. I'm a little older than a lot of people in the crowd here, but there actually was long distance market. No one thinks about long distance anymore, even though we have a couple items that the commission still plugging along on some of those lines. So that's the framework. Now that's the centerpiece of it. And then you add to it a bunch of other provisions, and that's somewhat how legislation can be done. There's multiple ways that it can be done in my 20-year career. You can have a particular topic and just stay focused to that topic and try to do a rifle shot. Well, this wasn't a rifle shot. It was a lot of different pieces over here, and then new pieces that came along. And then after the 94 election, different people had different ideas, and that's one way to craft legislation. When I contemplate how could you do legislation now, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about it. The other option is that you have a bunch of people that want different things. The market is dynamic, and a lot of people on behalf of their interests are seeking a lot of different things, and you try and figure out how do you corral all of those things into a bill. And that's really what the 96 Act, it's got certainly local competition is the forefront, but you have media ownership, you have some wireless, some of the previous wireless were done in previous statutes, or some of the wireless things were done previously, and you have a number of other provisions that are added to that, and that's how the legislation came about. There were many times where the struggle looked like it was going to die, and my old boss, being as the old gentleman that he is, was gracious and worked through all the different ways to make legislation work, and he had a unique ability and a unique skill to bring about that law. In fairness, a lot of those provisions, in my take, given the history, were backward leaning and backward looking and looking rather than forward looking and what was happening. And Congress has that difficulty. Legislating for the future is very difficult from their perspective. So some of it was always going to be looking back, and that's how we ended up in the 96 Act.
You just ended with I thought a very interesting observation about the role of legislation looking forward and the challenge of any legislation looking forward. You also mentioned the role of Competition Act. My sense is that you would put the embrace of competition in that forward-looking category in the 96 Act.
Oh, absolutely. It was definitely, a way and forefront of my bosses and many members of Congress at the time. How do we let the competitive environment that was, in many segments of the communications industry, how do we let that flourish? How do we take examples that have done very well and apply them in other instances? And how do we open up markets that were once closed, deemed natural monopolies at one time that no longer needed to be? So it really was it's an effort to take lessons and viewpoints at the time and try to apply them going forward, but not knowing what the market, you don't have that crystal ball, you don't know what's going to happen. We didn't know that you were going to head into certain recessions. We didn't know what the internet was going to be at the time, and from my perspective.
And in that regard, while being sort of forward-looking in some ways, I think many people have now observed that the Telecommunications Act itself has very few references to the thing that is maybe most central to many people's lives these days, and that is the internet. So can you maybe comment on the role of the insiders at the time and the discussions that were had and the thinking at the time surrounding this, at the time, new thing called the internet and how that was going to unfold?
This is my perspective. Other people may have different takes on it, but the internet is mentioned a number of times in the Telecom Act, not predominantly. Most of it dealt with the CDA, the Communications Decency Act. Not surprising, one of the first segments to take off on the internet was pornography, and that led to a particular take on it from the Congress that was overturned by the courts. But be it as it may, beyond that, there's not a lot of reference to the internet and what it may become, because at the time, many members had no idea what the internet was. They weren't familiar with it. It was a new opportunity, and quite frankly, a lot of them, recollection.
You say that like it was all in the past. You want to amend that? Do members today understand?
I don't make any. I make no criticism of members of Congress. I meant it in a loving way that at the time they rightfully wouldn't have too much exposure to the internet and what it was at that infancy moment. And so now to look back, it's not surprising. And quite frankly, a lot of the, and I remember a couple conversations trying to struggle through different particular pieces like Section 706 and other things, where there just was a realization that is going to have to be another Congress to deal with it. We can only handle so much this Congress, and some of those things are going to have to be dealt by a future Congress, hoping, I think from any legislator's perspective, that once we had, able to update the 34 Act substantially in 1996, that there wouldn't be such a lag time before Congress returned to the topic. It wouldn't be something we would do on a yearly basis, but it would be something that could be done more often than it actually has done.
Well, certainly the technology has changed a lot in the last 20 years.
Oh gosh, yes.
And so now let me grant to you magical powers. Suppose that you had a magic...
Well, first, am I chairman yet? Still not chairman. Oh, that's okay. That's okay. I'm totally comfortable.
Today you may not want to be chairman. So if you had magical powers, and with the hindsight you have now and that we have collectively, as you look back, what might we have done a little differently? And let's say, let me grant you the license to either with your magical powers, either operate in a legislative arena or in a regulatory arena. What would we have done differently, knowing that what we know now, as matters unfolded over the next few years after that?
First of all, if I had my time machine, I wouldn't be in this segment of the industry. I'd be elsewhere in Wall Street. But there are a number, and I've given a couple speeches on this topic. What would you have done differently? And I don't mean this in any criticism of the good work that the members were able to reach an agreement on a very difficult issue, struggling for so many years to finally reach agreement, and such an accomplishment to so many of their careers. So I don't mean that as a criticism, but I've given speeches on the topic. What would you do differently, giving the history and what happened? And I would say, if I were still on Capitol Hill, and I've recommended this to people who are there now, that they plan for and put into statute exactly what they mean. Don't leave it up to chance. Don't leave it up to, well, we know we have a regulatory body that will do the right thing. The regulatory body doesn't always do the right thing. It doesn't necessarily mean that they necessarily get it wrong, but sometimes they do, from the perspective of those who actually draft provisions. So put everything you can into the statute. If you don't want the commission to do something and you have regulatory, then tell them what you don't want them to do. So be very explicit. So what authority you're exactly giving them and what authority you're not giving them. And I took that lesson, the 96 Act. I stayed many more years in the House, but I took those experiences when I moved over to the Senate to work for members there. And that was very beneficial. That's why you see provisions that I worked on behalf of members much more specific, much more in terms of outlining what authority I think that the FCC should have at the time. And I think my second commentary in terms of the 96 Act is, it's tough to predict the future, which we sort of talked about. It's tough to figure out you couldn't have figured at the time that the internet was pretty much going to eat every market segment, that we were going to have a huge glut in broadband build out where everyone, I remember sitting at a conference and seeing all of the build out plans for broadband nationwide, the huge pipes that the companies are building, and you could see the maps overlapping, and you realize there's a problem here. There's too much, and these companies are over leveraged, and so you're looking at this going, I certainly hope this works, but it doesn't exactly seem like it might, and it didn't. A lot of those companies went belly up. A lot of the technology, a lot of the fiber optics in the ground became modern internet and made it cheap, but it's because of the collapse of a lot of those companies that we were able to have some of the modern internet. But you couldn't have planned that going in. You didn't know some of the things that were going to collapse. You didn't know the long distance industry was basically going to collapse at the time. So it's very difficult to plan for the future, no matter what starting point you have.
Just on that answer,
Sure.
if it's difficult to forecast into the future, and maybe especially difficult in an industry like this that has technological change that is just constantly exceeding itself, is it a particular special legislative and regulatory challenge to be as specific as you might like to be, to tell people do X, don't do Y, when X and Y may not even exist in 10 years?
Well, I think you still believe that that there'll be a future Congress and that they will act and have an opportunity to legislate, in the future. So maybe it's not going to be an every year thing, but it's going to be periodically. And as I lived through this, after the 96 Act, there were fights over how do you regulate broadband in the House Commerce Committee, and not too later. And I was thinking back to 2000, I think it was 2005, we were doing a big telecom rewrite or communications rewrite in the Senate Commerce Committee. So it's not that every couple of years you're going to have the push to try and do something along these lines. So defining X and Y for a particular moment is not problematic necessarily if Congress is going to still be engaged. And they are trying to, to legislate in this space and have periodically done this. So I don't see it that problematic. But in any event, it gets to the point that becomes, in defining what authority you are advocating or presenting or authorizing from a congressional perspective, defining exactly how those parameters are to be is not that problematic from my perspective. If the provision becomes outdated, then so be it. Let a future Congress address the matter. If the provision needs to modify, then that's what a future Congress is for. So I don't think it's that problematic to put the parameters. I certainly think it's more it's increasingly beneficial for those that are in my seat or at the regulatory body to know what Congress would really like. If they would like us to do something on net neutrality, I've said they should legislate. That is the way to answer the questions for be all and once and for all. So I think that's the benefit of changing the law.
Okay, let me take away your magical powers now.
Okay.
I'm sorry. And suppose now, as is the case, we are in a world where the Telecommunications Act of 1996 governs. Do you have, at the commission, do you have the tools that you need? That's the toolkit. Do you have the tools you need to move forward to advance telecommunications policy in the interest of the public, in the public interest today?
Well, it depends on you know, I believe we have the bounds that Congress has given us. Mm-hmm. And so if they would like to see us do different things, then they will give us new authority. It's not my job to try and stretch provisions of the law to respond to the fact that they haven't legislated. Not legislating is a decision for them to make. They may have other priorities to deal with in their current, you know, there are a lot of things happening in the world. So the fact that telecommunications isn't their #1 priority is not a shocking thing, given we have 2 wars, we have a lot of things happening in the world at the current moment. So that's not shocking from my perspective. And if they do not provide that authority, it's not my job to try and figure out how to get that authority and read provisions. We've had a couple examples in last administration where we were taking different provisions of the statute and basically stapling them together to create new standards. That's a crazy perspective. That's not what Congress intended, and I don't think that's my job. I actually completely disagree with that approach. So to the extent that there is an authority, we shouldn't act. To the extent there is authority, they've told us to do something, we should certainly do so.
Fair enough. Let me open it up to questions, and just because we, as always, are videotaping this event for posterity's sake, so you can go back and watch it, we need people to be on a microphone when they ask their question, and we have Georgetown staff members on each aisle. If you could just simply raise your hand, and when you get the attention of one of the staffers, proceed to the aisle if you're not already sitting on the aisle, as that gentleman is. Please introduce yourself and your organization, and as much as possible, try and keep your questions reasonably succinct so we can get to more questions. Thank you.
Hi, Ricky Ubi, economist at the U.S. International Trade Commission. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the implications of a potential fall of net neutrality on international trade in digital goods and services.
So a couple things. One, we're in the middle of a proceeding on net neutrality. I'm going to see where the record plays out in the topic. We're going to take comments for pretty much the rest of the summer. I've made the point publicly, and that I have an open mind in the sense that I'm waiting for comments to see if they change my previous perspective, which I've outlined in many different speeches. I think that's the obligation in my job, is I had previous viewpoints, I've articulated them on the last go-around, and now we have a new proceeding. The chairman puts out a very thoughtful approach, asks a ton of questions, and I'm waiting to see if any of the comments change my perspective. In terms of what we do later this summer into fall, that's to be determined in terms of the timing and also the subject matter by the chairman at the start, and then I'll certainly have my thoughts going in. But so you kind of have this hypothetical that you raise, but if you play it through as I have, and you travel internationally, you talk to what others have done, you see that Europe has done a slightly different approach, and they have a different perspective on things like paid prioritization, zero rating, they have a different perspective on. In terms of their vigor and desire for some of these things, I feel that they have, this is not me putting words in their mouth, but they believe that they were dragged to enact something that they necessarily may not have wanted to do, but the politics being as it may, they got to where they are. So I don't think that's the best way you legislate communications policy, but when I say what does it matter for digital trade, for the heart of your question, I don't know that it has all that much impact. I don't think that domestically, I don't think you're going to see that much different behavior in the United States. I don't see that if net neutrality were eliminated at some point, the rules that we have on our books, that I certainly don't agree with parts of them and have articulated. I don't agree with a roving general conduct standard, and I don't agree with a ban on paid prioritization. But if the totality or all, some portions of those don't exist, I don't see the behavior from our broadband providers changing that much. There were behavior before the rules were enacted that was not problematic. The instances that people point to as those are the ones we've got to put rules on because of those behaviors turned out not to be necessarily true. I mean, the courts have agreed, the commission has agreed the rules that we enacted were prophylactic, meaning that we're trying to guess the future. I think I've already commented on guessing the future. So I don't see that having a huge impact in terms of our free flow of data internationally, in terms of our trade of goods, in terms of for international trade purposes, which I happen to be a strong in favor of free trade. So I don't see that having a huge impact or negative connotation. Certainly there'll be a lot of commentary and Twitter, if we get to that point, but I don't see that having a huge impact.
Another question. Right here.
Lynn Stanton, TR Daily. In some of the commentary on today's day of action regarding the internet and internet policy, there have been some statements that the FCC is supposed to look at the quality of the arguments, not the quantity, that it shouldn't be a plebiscite or a survey or a counting of noses. That argument seems to be applied to individual members of the public filing comments. The chairman has held up, we have all of these individual small ISPs saying, look how badly we're affected by the policy under the Wheeler administration. What is your thought, not in terms of the specific proceeding that's currently ongoing that you can't comment on, but just in general, in terms of the ability and the role of individuals to make their comments known, and how that differs from counting noses? And
Sure. So I don't have a separation between whether comments are filed by individuals or on behalf of groups or behalf of companies or behalf of whomever. I don't have a separation. I look for substantive comments and what can change what is actually influencing the discussion. So it may be an individual that has very thoughtful comments, and I will certainly delve into them and consider them as part of any proceeding. And I try to do that no matter who files the comment. So it's not the person, it doesn't mean that an individual comments are that problematic or an individual ISPs are problematic and I need a big group to file. That's not certainly my viewpoint. But I do look for substantive comments. And so I've got quite a few that have come in on this topic that we're talking about today. And a number of them are quite colorful. They don't really, I wish I could repeat. There was just one sentence that one lady sent to me earlier this week. Don't be a blank, blank, blank. And you're like, okay. And I don't know what to do with that. It doesn't, I understand, I understand the sentiment. I appreciate the passion in terms of the views that she has on the topic, but that doesn't influence how I perceive paid prioritization, right? So I appreciate, and I am certainly not going to discount all of the comments in any way. I'm not dismantling individuals who do say such things. I don't take a head count, though. I've said I don't believe that our commentary process is a Dancing with the Stars contest. We just don't add them all up and see which side won by the number of votes that were had. I mean, that's not how Congress is a representative institution, and we are supposed to guide ourselves at the commission, at least in my days of working on, in terms of the statute, we're driven by the law and the record. And so the record can have only so much weight when there's not substantive comments behind them. I will give them weight, but if there's 200 million over here and 20 over here, but 200 million don't have anything behind them, there's only so much weight I can give that, and that's how I've approached it. So individual comments, great, I'd love to see them. Substantive comments over, people letting off steam.
Another question.
Hi, my name is Deborah Lathan. Hello, Commissioner. I was
How are you
previously, I'm good, thank you. Previously at the FCC. And I just want to follow up on this question. I often get questions from consumers who are petrified that they're not going to have net neutrality And then they asked me, what is net neutrality? So my question to you is, not within this proceeding, but from your perspective, how would you define to a consumer what net neutrality is?
So that's one of the most important questions that I've written about this topic in a given speech. The conversation has morphed. In 2005, it was one thing. It was about a couple key principles, and we tried to figure out, is there a way to legislate on those key principles? We couldn't quite find the commonality on them. It has morphed into this belief now that every data packet has to be treated equal treatment, which makes no sense. That's not how, and I've made this point publicly, that's not how the internet operates today, and if you were to move towards that approach, you would kill the internet. So to me, it's difficult when people say, I have to have my net neutrality, right? But they don't know what exactly it means. Your point's extremely well taken. So I have to take that with a grain of salt. It's like, okay, people, give me my net neutrality, but do you know what it means? No. Okay, well, all right. My job is that's why I was hired, right, is to understand the substantive matters. I don't work on some other matters that I don't know as much about. And so this is my area of expertise to some degree. Some people may disagree with that statement. But to the extent I have an expertise, this is where I focus. And so I've spent time working on what is the definition as it's morphed over time and how damaging it would be if we really did implement what people really think it means. And that's why you see things like paid prioritization. I got to have paid prioritization, I got to have a ban on paid prioritization, or I got to have the general conduct standard, which came out of pretty much nowhere in the last go-around. It's just this roving idea that the commission can do what it wants, when it wants, because it doesn't know what's going to happen in the future. So we just want, a band of the commission staff to just kind of look around constantly and just, that's good, that's bad, this is good, that's bad. Pretty tough regulatory process from my perspective, and I don't support it. But that's how the definition is kind of morphed to fit the goals as the sides have become more strident.
Another question. There's one in the back.
Hi, Commissioner. Tara Jeffries, Bloomberg BNA. So I've been seeing statements from AT&T, Verizon, Charter, et cetera, basically saying that the antidote to Title II is permanent bipartisan legislation, no throttling, no blocking, all that good stuff. But as you put it, it's hard to legislate for the future. And given your previous legislative experience, what do you see the role of permanence being?
Permanence is in the eye of the beholder. There's always a future Congress that can undo past decisions, and that's an opportunity. But I have argued that the only way we're going to get lasting peace in this space is to have legislation, and for Congress to decide what it wants in legislation. I personally, if I were still advocating, there are many pieces that I don't think should be in that legislation, but that's for them to decide. They were elected by the people of the United States, not me, and so they get to make those decisions in terms of what goes in and what wouldn't go in any type of legislation. But that's the only way that I think you can actually have, bipartisan legislation that actually can stand somewhat test of time versus, depending on what commission and what election happens at any given moment. To get something through the Senate requires extraordinary work. I worked there 11 years. It takes a lot of effort, and when it does, most members are pretty of the mindset that they're not going to return to that space for a little bit of time. They're pretty much wiped out with a particular topic, and they move on to something else for a good amount of years, unless there needs some technical corrections. But generally, they're just like, we're done with that issue, move on to the next topic, right? So it's not something that they return to on a yearly basis, as I mentioned earlier. So I'm fully supportive and have advocated that legislation is the way to go. What goes into the legislation, we can have a full-on debate. And that gets to Deborah's question in terms of the definition. It gets to what are these functional components. The chairman likes to, the past chairman, threw around, it's 3 bright line rules and a roving provision. A couple of those I certainly wouldn't see necessity being in any legislation. And I could argue quite convincingly that blocking and throttling aren't actually behavior that ISPs would engage in any situation, and therefore including them in legislation is unnecessary. But again, all of that is really immaterial because that's for the Congress to decide, not me. But I think that's the only way to get you some, get a time period, not permanency, but get a time period of some stability so it doesn't change based on who's chairman at the given moment.
Maybe we have time for one final question if you've got it.
I stumped the crowd and everyone came in for the AC, right?
There's some pressure. Right here.
Oh, hi, David Leduc with the Software and Information Industry Association. Unfortunately, I'm old enough to remember working with you, Mike, back in the mid-'90s when you were Senator Sununu, and indeed the internet was very...
I was taller and better looking, right?
You were much? Yeah, both of us. And you're right, no one, I mean, we didn't, I worked for technology industry and we didn't even understand where the internet was going, so you're right on there. I wanted to raise a question about your comments and your thoughts on paid prioritization. I think there's broad agreement, not necessarily broad, certainly not unanimous agreement, but I think there's a lot of understanding about the need for some preferential treatment, representing a wide range of technology companies. We get that. So, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are on, the current proposal. On one end of the spectrum, I think you're absolutely right. We need to have some type of, prioritization, right? That's how the internet has always worked. On the other end, there's a real potential for harm. Do you think the current proposal addresses that, or do you think you need to do more to be able, and you can do more without legislation to address that balance?
Well, again, it gets to the legislation question, which I talked about, in terms of how they would define good prioritization versus bad prioritization, right? Trying to figure out what is acceptable is something for them to deal with. We don't, it has been the murky question at the commission for a long while, and no one's come up with the right scenario, because defining good and bad in any given moment changes over time. So that if they were to define it in their purpose, I hope that they don't include it in any legislation. I don't think it should be included because I think you need room to grow. I also don't, again, I try not to predict what might happen in the future. You do the best you can, but I try not to be too far out there. And so when you think about answering questions for too much in the future in terms of what prioritization may look like, you have to leave extra space for business models that we don't know about today. And I think that's a very key point, that what looks like bad prioritization today may be good prioritization tomorrow. And so I'm very leery about answering those questions. Certainly at my level, I hope the Congress doesn't go this route, but that's for them to decide.
So let me thank all of you for asking such good questions and for furthering the reflections on this day of action that we have. And I also want to thank Commissioner O'Rielly for taking the time out of his very busy schedule. Please help me thank Commissioner O'Rielly.
Thank you.